Welcome back, drifters. Man, it feels good to say that again. It's been so long. Feels good to be back in the garage. Today we're in the garage and I'm going to be working on the 67 Mustang. This is first time back doing this in about a year, so I think this video I'm probably just going to give you guys kind of a general idea of what's going on, what the game plan is moving forward, and kind of how we're just going to tackle this monster, because this thing, it needs a lot of work. So let me show you where we're starting. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get this car level, because right now it's slightly off. It's jacked up by the suspension, which is not what we want to do because, well, we need to measure the frame and make sure that the frame is straight, because before we go cutting pieces of that off, if we go welding it back together and it's crooked, we're just going to have a new crooked frame. So let me show you how we do that. So now the way I got this thing jacked up right now is I've got it up on the axles and I'm just holding it up by that because it still has the rear suspension set up, which is fine for holding the car, but it's not going to give us an accurate representation because these leaf springs here are not necessarily going to be the exact same when they're compressed or when they're relaxed. So what we really need to do is hold this thing up by the frame of the car as well as the pinch welds up on the rockers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this thing all leveled up. Now up in the front I've got it mounted up to part of the suspension. Now this part of the suspension is pretty solid, but it's also not the way we want to do it. We want to be going off of the frame rails here, so that way we know that it's nice and secure and it's not going to shift on us. Because these frame rails that run along here are the things that we need to make sure are straight and according to the diagram. I'll show you the diagram here in a second. So you might be asking yourself, well, Kyle, why are you going to replace the whole frame? It looks pretty good. Well, we're not replacing the entire frame because a lot of it is good, but the floor supports is where the real problem is. Those things are chewed up. They don't look great. The one I actually repaired a while back, problem is that the rust that I found actually went way deeper. I mean, it goes under the actual floor support. I started cleaning it up and trying to get it ready because I was going to do the torque boxes, and I discovered that the rust went all the way down to the actual box end of the bulkhead. So, you know, it just means that we're going to have to actually replace the floor supports. Luckily, I have new floor supports, but we're going to have to take the old ones off. That's going to be a video all on its own. We're not doing that today. Okay, so when it comes to these measurements, I'm going off of a document that I found from Ford, and it's from literally 1967. So it's like, it looks like it's hand-drawn. But I'll try to put an image up here so you can kind of see what's going on. Basically, this thing here is the diagram for where we're going to get all of our measurements for the frame. Now, I'm going to do as many of these as I can. A lot of it's just using a tape measure, but it's pointless to do those measurements if the car's not level. So I need to make sure that the first thing I do is get this car completely level, so that way when we take these measurements, we know for a fact that we're getting the correct measurements and that it's not just because the car's slightly off or maybe the frame's like slightly going one way or the other. We want it to be as level as possible. And now I'm just going to tell you, I don't know if this is going to work or not. We're just going to try it and see what happens and see if we can get close to those numbers. And if we do get close enough, then shoot, I'll be happy. So my main area that I'm concerned with is this front passenger side, because you can see here that part of the frame was getting repaired at some point, and they did a really bad job. Not to mention that this whole section of the frame is basically rusted through. I mean, take a look at this. Yeah, that's not exactly ideal, but it's okay because we're going to replace this entire section of frame. I literally have from like basically right there forward. So we're going to literally cut that out and put in a new piece, and that should solve that problem. But it's really important that we check to make sure that that's straight before we actually cut it off and weld on a new piece, because if it's crooked and we put on a new piece, it's just going to be a new crooked piece. So we'll fix the rust, but we won't fix the frame, and we don't want to do that. So again, that's why these measurements are important. All right, well, let's go move the jack stands around, try to get this thing as level as we can, and we'll just kind of go from there. Okay, so I got this thing up on jacks. We got it pretty much leveled off. Now, the problem is I really need to find out if it's level, but the only way I can do that is with a datum line, which it might be called something different. It might be a baseline, whatever, it doesn't matter. We need to have a level playing field to actually measure from, because if you're doing this in a garage like I am, the garage is going to have a slant to it. Let me show you what I mean. So you can see here, I got my level laid out. Now, this is like a 4-foot level. You could obviously do a bigger one to see it more exaggerated, but you can see that it's not quite exactly level. So if I were to take my measurements from where it's sitting right now, it's going to be slightly higher in the front of the car than it is in the back of the car, just because of the slope of the driveway. Now, what we have to do to compensate for that is we need to have some sort of line that we know for sure is truly level, and then we take measurements from that line. Problem is, I don't have that right now. So I'm going to have to go to the store and pick up some of this stuff so that way we can do this. I'm probably not going to get that done today. I'm going to have to do that tomorrow, which will probably just happen, you know, probably like right now. So I've been waiting for about the last 20 minutes for this guy blowing his leaves to stop. But so if you hear that in the background, I'm sorry. It's just, he's taking them all day. But anyway. Okay, so it's the next day, and we're in the garage, and we took a trip to Lowe's, and I got some tools. My dad came over and gave me a hand because some of this stuff's kind of a two-person job because it's hard to do some of these measurements by yourself. I mean, I probably could, but it was just nice having my dad help me. But yeah, what we did is we ended up building this thing that's basically a level playing field that we can use to measure from. Let me show you what we did. So basically what we did is we took this piece of wood here, we put another piece of wood with a nail and some string, we ran it all the way down there, so it's about an 8-foot section, and we put a level on it. Now this level, you can see there, is perfectly level, and this goes the length of this board, all the way from one end to the other. So this is the measuring line that we're going to use when we measure, so we'll have a consistent level point to measure down the length of the car. Now before we get our keyboard mechanics on here, and I know that this is not the most accurate way to do this, I'm not building a jig, I'm not building this thing from the frame all the way up. All I'm doing is trying to verify that, hey, my frame is at least somewhat straight. I mean, I just want to make sure that when this thing's going down the road that we're not riding and dog tracking sideways, you know? So it should be okay for our purposes. If we were building this thing completely from scratch, I'd build a jig, but I'm not building a jig. Gotta love these planes. So here's the part that kind of sucks, is taking this measurement. So for this measurement, it depends on which diagram you use, because there's two different diagrams that I've seen for this car. One of them's having you measure from the bolt point up here, and the other one measures from the lower portion of the front cross member. Now, I don't really care which one that I'm measuring from, I just want my measurements to be consistent. So I measured the front here, and then I would measure all the other points going back. And then what we would do is we would just subtract the difference from whatever measurement they use to ours, because we're all measuring from the same line. So we know that as long as we're still within those numbers, we should be okay. Problem is that some of our numbers were a little bit off. So one of the first major issues that I noticed was like the measurement from the front of the chassis to about the midpoint. For us, it was supposed to be basically an 8-inch drop. And for us, we were only getting like a 5-inch drop. And that's literally just measuring from the front side of the frame to the midpoint of the frame. Like, we can't control that drop. That drop is just designed into the frame rail. And according to this, we're off by like 3 inches. That has nothing to do with whether or not the front of the car is up or the rear is up. I mean, it's just, yeah, so some of these measurements we're gonna have to go over. But the good thing is, all the measurements that we got that were like for the cross references, like all the ones that would go across the frame rail, so we'd had some that come from one side to the other, all those seem to be okay. So since we got all the measurements to see whether or not the car was actually level front to back, then we had to do a bunch of measurements that measured the width and also crosswise. Now the problem is that we don't have the cowl on this thing, so there's some measurements that we can't really get without that. So what we did is we came in here and we measured, like for instance, this sway bar here. We could measure these two bolt hole locations side to side to see how close we are, and we were within, I think it was within about 1/16 of an inch, so it's very, very close. So the only other area that I'm a little bit worried about is these lower control arm mounts. Now the measurement between them is supposed to be like 19 1/8, according to the one diagram. I get like 18 3/4, but I'm not too concerned because most likely all this is going to come out anyway, because I'm going to be doing a completely custom suspension anyway. And here's the thing, when you look at the frame rail, typically if there was a wreck or something, there would be obvious damage. Usually there would be signs of stress in the actual frame rail, but this thing just looks straight as hell to the naked eye. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily straight, but man, it looks like it until you get up here. Now this could be a problem. But this whole front section here is going to get replaced anyway. I've already got the new frame rail in a box, so I'm not super concerned about that. So now the only other spot that I'm kind of concerned with is back here in these rear frame rails. Let me show you. So this is the rear frame rail, and it kind of runs along here, goes all the way back, goes all the way over the tire, and up into a torque box up in the front. So the problem is with our measurements, the driver's side is about a 1/2 inch higher up than the passenger side. It's about a 1/2 inch lower. Now, I don't know if that really matters, because when we took the measurements from the actual leaf spring bolts, the measurements were identical on both sides. So I'm starting to think that it might just be the way that the garage floor is sitting, and that maybe that these jack stands are sitting just slightly off a little bit. But Who knows? So when you look at this frame rail, you can see that it's nice and straight. Runs all the way back there, and I see almost no kinks at all. I mean, it looks solid. So I don't think that that's necessarily the issue. Now, another thing it could be is that it could be that maybe the weight is being set on the jack stands that are holding up the suspension, and that it's not actually sitting on the body. So it could be something related to that. Okay, so I just lowered this thing so it's no longer sitting on the suspension. We're gonna see if our measurements are any different. Well, front end ain't in there, right? Well, this seems safe. So now, I know this does not look perfect, but these are basically how we took our measurements. We did a driver's side, a passenger side. We wrote it down, and then we compared between these measurements and then the measurements we got on the chart. And essentially what I was doing was, because we don't have it the exact same height, I would take like the front measurement and then take the second measurement, figure out the difference, and then compare that to what we got. And to give you perspective, like between points A and B, on mine is just under an inch, but it's supposed to be 3/4 of an inch. So, but here's the thing, the driver and the passenger side are the exact same measurements. So I'm pretty sure that even though my measurements don't exactly line up with what they say, my measurements are consistent from front to back. So the only exception would be the rear frame rail up in the back corner is up by like, it's a little bit under 1/2 of an inch. Now, that could be potentially from how the car is sitting. It might not be perfectly level side to side because we're measuring from front to back, so I don't know how level it is side to side. That may be something I need to look at in the future, but for right now, all the other measurements, everything else is looking really good. So I think we're good to move forward with this build. Now, if any of you have experience with doing this kind of stuff, maybe you have some tips or tricks that you could give me a little bit of insight. Maybe there's just something that I'm missing, put it down in the comments, let me know, because, I mean, this is my first time doing this stuff, so I am by no means an expert when it comes to this. I'm just following a diagram and doing my measurements, so yeah, we'll see. So anyway, I appreciate you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm still kind of getting back into the swing of things, so if I'm a little rusty or a little slow on the uploads, just bear with me. I'm getting back into this thing, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.